So welcome everyone to another in our series of conversations between Harpal Brar and Caleb Maupin. And today we're going to be talking about Palestine. Now, initially when we scheduled this talk, it was before the launch of the Operation, Al-Aqsa Flood Battle this weekend. So obviously it's changed our agenda a little bit. And I think we are going to start by talking about the current situation before we try to delve back a little further into the origins, the roots of the problem in the Middle East. But I'm going to start by asking Harpal for your initial response to the events that are unfolding right now in the Middle East, in Palestine.
Well, I have to say, even at the cost of annoying the authorities and right-wingers and revisionists in the communist movement, it was such an unexpected welcome present on the 7th of October. Woke up. I didn't hear the news. A friend of mine came to see us and he informed us, have you heard the news? And then we looked at everything. And it was remarkable, because one of the things it proves is no matter how strong the Zionist army gets, no matter what sophisticated weaponry it acquires, actually with each passing days, it is much weaker than its opponents, even if it can absolutely overwhelm them by its weaponry, because human beings live on the ground. And when you live on the ground, you have to share that space with other people. And if you're oppressing them, you cannot be free. Karl Marx pointed out long while ago, a nation that oppresses another cannot be free. A people who oppress another people cannot be free. And the Israeli, one of the sick jokes of history is that one of the most intelligent people and people who before the Second World War were one of the most progressive people, so much so that one of the Nazi propaganda was that Bolshevism was just a product of Judaism. So they were fighting against not only Bolsheviks, but against Judaism, because they thought behind the Bolsheviks stand the Jews. Behind Stalin stands Kaganovich, and he's the one who's calling the tune, not Stalin. Because and for these people to be actually roped in by this most reactionary, racist, and really anti-Semitic ideology like Zionism is a tragedy. It's a tragedy not only for the Palestinians, for people generally, progressive people generally, but it's especially a tragedy for the Jews themselves, because they're on to hiding to nothing. Nothing will come out of it, because with each action that they take against the Palestinians, they are actually pressing a self-destruct button, which will result in the destruction of Israel. It will result in it because after a while, the Jewish people who live in Israel would get fed up with, you cannot from decade to decade and from century to century go on with this fight. After each operation, the Zionists say, yes, we have now smashed the Hamas or whoever they're fighting against so that it will never rise again. And like Phoenix, it arises again every 3 years. And the Zionists are very proud of their intelligence services. But it's clear to me that the resistance also has its intelligence services, which actually can match them. They're not relying on high technology. They're relying on information on the ground. They're able to gather precisely what is happening. And for them to actually, with even a backward technology, to have a coordinated offensive from the sea, from the land, and from the air, using boats, using motorbikes, using paragliders, to actually have inflicted such a devastating blow to the Zionist state of Israel. They're all shocked, and their patrons are shocked. How could they do it? How could such backward people do that? How could they dare to disturb our sleep? What they don't understand is they don't let the Palestinians sleep on any given day. And people will be telling you that now the Palestinians have asked for it, they get punished. Well, the fact of the matter is they are being punished whether they do anything or not. And you must have seen a wonderful interview by the CNN with Mustafa Barghouti. They obviously called him because he's very soft-spoken, he's a moderate guy, he's highly intelligent. They thought they get something out of him, which will just be anti-Hamas. He said, no, the problem is the occupation. That is what is causing the problem. That's what's causing the hurt to be caused, both to the Israelis and to the Palestinians. And therefore, if you want to deal with this problem, you must go to the root of it and end the occupation. That is, even if you are going to stick by the previous arrangement, whereby Palestinians painfully accepted only 22% of their country to actually establish a state of their own. And the Zionists cannot even accept such a wonderful bargain in their favor. And they are, as Stalin used to say, whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad. The Israeli Zionists have gone mad, and that's what they're doing. They rely only on weaponry, but weapons are not, in the final analysis, the decisive force. Otherwise, you could never fight against the ruling class. The bourgeoisie could never have fought against the kings and queens. The proletariat could never have fought against Tsarism successfully. The Vietnamese could never have fought against American imperialism. The Korean and Chinese people could never have fought against American imperialism. Afghans, with the most backward ideology, have beaten the Americans to it. The Syrians have beaten them to it. But of course, they don't learn the lesson. 3, 4, 5 years, they come back with new aggressive plans. So if they want any advice from me, and I'm not in the business of advising imperialism and the Zionists, but my advice to them is just give up your wars of aggression, give up your predatory behavior, give up the occupation, come to learn to live with the Palestinians as fellow equal human beings. Create a single state, binational state, where the Palestinians as well as the Jews have equal rights. The thing could work, and there would be peace, not only in Israel, but there will be peace in the Middle East as well. But if the Zionists carry on like that, it will put paid to all their hopes of the Abraham Accords coming to their rescue, their rapprochement with the Saudis, with the UAE, and various countries, and of course, combined with their weaponry, they don't have to worry about the Palestinians. But Palestinians are actually the sword of the Middle Eastern People's Revolution, and they will not go away. They will not lie quietly under occupation and under oppression, and that's really the thing. And the scale of devastation caused by the latest Palestinian offensive is such that it hasn't been like that since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. I would go further, say it hasn't been on this scale since the formation of the State of Israel in 1948. And of course, people are hurt. I take no joy in anybody being killed, whether they're Palestinians or the Israelis. But unfortunately, in this world, killing is very much a part of the liberation struggle. You know, those who would make an omelette, they have got to learn to break eggs. And people get killed. Palestinians are being killed all the time. And those people who don't actually sympathize with the Palestinians, who don't condemn Israeli attacks, have the least right now to come up and asking everybody to condemn Hamas for its actions. Hamas does not need to be condemned. Standing, or whoever is taking part in this struggle, Hamas is not the only organization. They are fighting for their liberation. If they did not fight for it, they would cease to qualify to be called human beings. What do you think the Americans will do? What do you think the Americans did when there was an attack on Pearl Harbor? They joined the war. They fought with aeroplanes. They fought with armed forces. They fought with tanks and armored cars. Well, of course, the Palestinians cannot match that. They don't have an air force. Of course, they call their paragliders the Saraya Air Force, right? It's good for their morale. But the thing is, they can't match the weaponry. But what they can match is determination and courage with which they fight, because they got nowhere to go. Every Israeli holds a double passport. They have come from Brooklyn or Manhattan or Paris or somewhere to claim Palestinian land as their land. And they are actually prisoners of that. I'm reminded of this wonderful girl, Ahed Tamimi. She was caught on the camera slapping an Israeli soldier who was trying to harass her. And it went viral. Millions of people saw it. And she was asked, what did she feel? She said, I'm not oppressed. I am free. It's the 15, 16-year-old Jewish kids who've been taught to hate the Palestinians and to fear them, and they go to bed with rifles and guns. They're the ones who are oppressed. I'm a freedom fighter. I can distinguish between right and wrong. And that is the spirit. People who have that spirit, whose children have that spirit, cannot be beaten. You can carry on beating them year after year, but in the end, the last laugh will be had by them because they will achieve their liberation.
Thanks, Dad. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points that you made before I hand over to Caleb. One of them was just to underline what you were saying. In the media, it's presented very much as Hamas v. Israel in the West. And of course, it's not Hamas v. Israel. It's the Palestinians versus the Zionists. And the truth is that every part of the Palestinian resistance is engaged in this war. It's clearly a united operation. They've all come out and said so. It's not only Hamas brigades. There are many others. There's PFLP, there's DFLP, there's Al-Quds, there's the Lions of Jenin. There's all kinds of groups involved, and they are working together, very clearly working together. The other thing is, again, to pick up the importance of the intelligence failure from the point of view of, so many people who live in the imperialist world really believe in the all-powerfulness of the state machineries over them. They seem like they see everything, they know everything. They can't be beaten because of the strength and the technology level, the high technology and complex web of surveillance that's everywhere. And there's no way around that, right? You can't get away from it. But it's really fascinating to see and inspiring to see how when people are mobilized to resist, they find a way. I was 13 years ago, I was at the museum in Bekaa in southern Lebanon, the Museum of Resistance run by Hezbollah, where they show you not only how their resistance fighters lived under Israeli occupation and what kind of armaments they used to fight back and what armaments they captured. There's an Israeli captured tank there and all kinds of things. But on one of the walls there is a chart of the occupation. And the resistance fighters of southern Lebanon knew the name, the location, and the army rank of every single member of the occupation force. And they show it to you on the wall of the Liberation Museum there in southern Lebanon. And this is their way of reminding people everywhere, look, the oppressors are not as strong as they seem. We worked it out. You can work it out too. And it's clear to me that the Palestinian resistance knows an awful lot about the occupation forces. Caleb.
Can I just make one point before Caleb takes over? I'm very keen to hear Caleb. Was he unable to answer the kind of reasoning we give? All the imperialist governments are now making it illegal to express any support for the resistance. In Britain, there's going to be a fine of £5,000 and prison sentence of 6 months if you actually support the resistance. I hope there will be thousands and thousands who will express support for the resistance. So the courts get chock-a-block with cases of this nature. People have to stand up. We can't be cowed down by people coming, some third-class politician like Tugun Dat or somebody coming and saying you can't, or Lindsey Graham in America. They're just mad people. They want to bomb Gaza so that it's total rubble and the people over there will never rise. In fact, what they will create, as Larry Johnson said in a program I heard this morning, like the Nazis bombed to rubble the city of Stalingrad. because thereby they hope to win. And actually what they created obstacles for their own tanks. They couldn't move through the rubble. And they created hiding places for the Soviet soldiers who had rifles and were fighting against the Nazis, who went on to beat them. So if they do that in Gaza, that's probably what it is. It won't be just Palestinians who will be living cheek by jowl to each other. It'll be the Israelis who will be living cheek by jowl in this highly densely populated place called Gaza, which is an open-air prison of 2.3 million people who live in terrible conditions. And the only way they can fight against Hamas is actually to eliminate 2.3 million Palestinians. And now that's a job, even I think, beyond the ability of Zionists, not their willingness to do so, but the ability of the Zionists. The whole of the Middle East will erupt, and there will be ramifications of these actions, which neither they nor their imperialist patrons will be able to control. Sorry, Caleb, I want to hear.
Well, I have a couple thoughts on what's been said so far. One of the points I've been making in my broadcasts and with people I talk about this is that the way things have gone down is really a large result of the failure of the strategy that came in with the Obama administration. Because since the time that Barack Obama took office, the strategy of the United States and Israel has been to divide the peoples of the Muslim world between Sunni and Shia. And the reason for this is because Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, is the center of resistance to Western imperialism and Zionism in that region. And right after Barack Obama took office, there was a huge amount of propaganda about what they called the Shia Crescent. And they tried to link Iran and the Syrian Arab Republic because Bashar Assad is an Alawite and other forces in the region, Hezbollah, and they pushed this notion that the resistance forces were actually Shia Muslims and Iran trying to take over. And then Barack Obama, his middle name was Hussein, still is, and the U.S. media played up, that he had gone to a Muslim school when he was a child living in Indonesia. And I pointed out to people, this is Barack Obama basically as a 21st century Napoleon. When Napoleon tried to conquer Syria and Egypt, he put up posters everywhere announcing he was a Muslim, and he was lying, but it was a propaganda technique. And he said, I've come to restore your rights. You should trust me. I'm a Muslim. Don't trust the British. And that Barack Obama, his presidency was largely about trying to regain the trust of various Muslim forces that had aligned with U.S. imperialism throughout the Cold War, most specifically the Muslim Brotherhood. And then the Saudis and the Muslim Brotherhood both played up this idea that Hezbollah, that Iran, that Syria were part of this Shia conspiracy, and that effectively fomented civil war in Syria. It divided the forces of resistance, and that has been the strategy. And this continued under the Trump administration. Donald Trump went to Saudi Arabia when he was president and pushed the idea he was going to form an Arab NATO. And this Arab NATO he was going to form would unify the Arab world against Iran. And Donald Trump got, I believe, Dubai and the United Arab Emirates, Dubai is part of the United Arab Emirates, but the United Arab Emirates and one other country to recognize Israel, 2 Arab states to recognize Israel. And they did so on the basis of cooperating with Israel against Iran. And the strategy of the United States has been to polarize that region between, Iran and its allies and the U.S. aligned wing of the Arab world, and in effect to divide the Palestinian resistance, divide opposition to Israel. That's failed. China has secured, friendship now between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iran and Saudi Arabia now have diplomatic relations once again as a result of the People's Republic of China that sat down and had talks with them. And the first train went from Moscow to Tehran all the way into Riyadh. Because of the efforts by Joe Biden to demand that Saudi Arabia end its relationship with Russia, which they're not going to do because Saudi Arabia is an oil exporting country and so is Russia. They need to be able to negotiate oil price outputs. The United States has alienated itself, and we've seen a reunification of forces in the region. So under these circumstances, Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, which has now been readmitted into the Arab League. You'll remember Syria is now recognized by all the Arab countries. Once again, the war is over. The Syrian government has won. Now, with the balance of forces shifted, the Palestinians were in a position where they could go on the offensive with much more widespread support. And this is the failure of the imperialist strategy of dividing the forces of resistance in the region. What they spent years doing with Obama and Trump and even continuing under Biden has completely failed. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And we're back in a situation. We remember in 2006 when Israel was driven out of Lebanon, the whole Muslim world was cheering for Hezbollah because it defeated the Israeli invaders. And we're back in that situation because now the whole Muslim world is cheering for the Palestinians. It's cheering for Hezbollah as Israel is once again isolated with people throughout the region opposing them. So I think that's an important thing to point out. I also wanted to point out on since we're going there, what Harpal pointed out about outlawing protest. I have never seen I've been in New York City for over a decade. I have never seen the amount of demonization and attack on the protests supporting Palestine as I've seen right now. There's generally pro-Palestine protests every time there's an intensification because there's many Muslims in New York City. There's many Arabs. There's many leftists. You generally have people who march through the streets with Palestine flags. But this time they are calling these demonstrations terrorist demonstrations. The Democratic Socialists of America, which has members of Congress, Ocasio-Cortez and others, has been forced to apologize for their participation in the protests that happened over the weekend on Sunday. There has been all of this demonization and calls for outlawing these protests, calling them hate rallies, calling them anti-Semitic, etc. And it's shocking. Meanwhile, the pro-Israel demonstrators have been caught on camera calling for the extermination of all Palestinians, saying things like, all Palestinians should be killed. And there doesn't seem to be much outrage about that, right? Imagine, if all the Palestine protesters were saying kill all Jews, that would be everywhere. But of course, they're not saying that. But the pro-Israel protesters have openly said things. It's time. They've said on camera to many reporters, it's time to just kill every Palestinian, just get rid of them. And no one seems to object. No one's calling for their protests to be outlawed. So what's interesting, though, is that that we're seeing among the pro-Israel protesters and the pro-Israel propaganda, we're seeing, first of all, a weaponization of that cancel culture, right? Where, it's like, oh, you're a fascist, you're a white supremacist, you're a racist, you better disavow, you must disavow. AOC apologized and disavowed the demonstration. And on top of that, they're using allegations that the Palestinians raped someone, which, again, that's not confirmed. They're using that to also attack the pro-Palestine marches, say these are pro-rape rallies because of that. That is the argument that they're making as well. And it also fits in with, the Me Too thing and how they're targeting, progressive movements with sex allegations. It's a similar thing. So they're using the same playbook that the false left and social democrats have used against revolutionary forces is now being used against anyone who says anything pro-Palestine. And I think you can fit this into what happened in your country to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn was a labor social democrat, but yet he was called anti-Semitic and forced out of his position. And you saw the Labor Party purging anyone who said anything pro-Palestine. Would you make that analogy? Would you say it's a similar thing?
Yeah. Shall I?
Yeah.
Yes, it is very, very similar because Jeremy Corbyn was no Bolshevik. Jeremy Corbyn was actually a social democrat of the type that you found in the 50s and 60s, nothing more than that. He had a mildly progressive program internally, and he certainly had been a supporter of the Palestinian people. But every crisis has some beneficial effects, because this crisis too has brought into daylight who are progressives and who are not progressives. The so-called left wing of the Labour Party is now characterized by its total silence. It dare not speak because they're all worried the moment they speak, and if they say a word in favor of Palestinian resistance, they'll be expelled from the Labour Party. And for them to be expelled from the Labour Party is like for very pious person to be ejected from heaven. Now, it's the imperialist party. Why the hell you want to be in it in the first place? Even Jeremy Corbyn, I haven't heard anything from him. He's been a supporter of Palestine. He could at least say it's the result of occupation, but they're not saying anything because he's hoping against hope that he'll be allowed to fight the next general election under the Labour ticket. He will not be allowed. I can tell him that he will not be allowed. But even if he were to be allowed, what is a member of parliament? It means nothing. Is one's honor worth anything? And of course, what happens is the Americans have turned into their opposite. When they fought their war of liberation, they fought with arms in hand and beat the British in that 5-6 year long war of liberation. And at that time, people like Thomas Jefferson could come and say that the tree of liberty from time to time has to be watered with blood. Now, why can't the Palestinians follow Thomas, the advice of the then American revolutionaries and water the tree of liberty, of their liberty, with blood? That's what they're doing. And the Americans should read their own history. I read their history more than I think the Americans do. But I need to read it. I need to find out about every liberation movement, what they did, and what is there to learn from it. Of course, they've turned into reaction. Miss Liberty has become Miss Oppression now. It no longer is, the Statue of Liberty no longer represents liberty. It represents oppression all over the world. But now that the governments are trying to actually outlaw everything, decent people need to come up and stand up and be counted. Because if you can't be counted in a period like that, if you keep your head down, you will never ever be able to fight for anything. They're outlawing everything. They're outlawing trade union protests. They're outlawing protests in support of Palestine. They're outlawing sports in favor of protests that actually show their war of aggression against Russia, which they are doing it through the proxy of Ukraine. But it's really sorting out. The so-called left wing has disappeared. All these people that Cable has mentioned, and what is the lady's name? Ilhan what?
Ilhan Omar. Yeah.
Omar. They're condemning Hamas. Why don't they condemn American imperialists? They sit in the chamber that is the source of that oppression. They can't see these 500 people sitting next to them and say, you are responsible for this tragedy. Instead, they go for somebody who's already being oppressed, namely the resistance fighters in Palestine. And so is the left wing. The so-called parties that call themselves communists have basically disappeared from the scene. The moment they say any danger, they raise the white flag. I mean, they don't even have to smell any cordite. They see from a long distance that there might be danger, and they try to hide it. Well, the working class cannot achieve its liberation by keeping its head below the parapet, no more than the bourgeoisie did in its own days. It fought with arms. Cromwell's army. They chopped the head of King Charles the first. And somebody pointed out you can't do that because it'd be regicide. Kings don't get heads chopped off. And Cromwell said, you'll see the axe will fall on his neck just as surely as on any ordinary criminal. They should remember their own revolutionary history, but their time is up, and they don't want to remember. Nobody celebrates Cromwell's victory in the camp of the bourgeoisie. Nobody celebrates the left wing of French Revolution. The period who represent in the French Revolution are called the terror period. Nobody has remembered that. Of course, they celebrate Bastille Day, but it's done in such a way that it does no harm. That we brought the rights of man, we brought the liberties of people, etc. But what they don't understand is the basic point of that revolution was to get rid of oppression and exploitation by an outmoded exploiting class and substitute exploitation by a new class. What we're trying to do, what the proletariat is trying to do, is to put an end to all exploitation and all oppression, not just of one class by another, but of all oppression and all exploitation. And the bourgeoisie is frightened of that. They may say communism is dead. Well, if it is dead, why are they constantly saying Marxism is dead? It makes no sense to actually constantly refer to dead people as being dead, because everybody knows they're dead. There's no need to say that communism is dead. Every time they say Marxism is dead, Marxism arises even more powerfully. The Tsarists thought that they'd finished communism in Russia. And what happened? The Tsars were overthrown. It was the communists who took over from them. And likewise, in a number of places, in China, in the DPRK, in Vietnam, and Cuba, and a number of other places where revolutionaries have taken over. And they will continue to do that. What imperialists are doing is to actually stand in the way of the forward march of humanity. And that is what is causing all the bloodshed. If they realized their time was up and they said, yes, we had good time for 200-300 years, now it's your time, I'm sure there would be no blood spilled. The communists are not bloodthirsty. They're not wanting to kill people for the love of it. No, they're doing it because they're in the van of the liberation struggles. And if the bourgeoisie decides to put impediments in the way, those impediments will be removed, whatever the cost.
Yes. I feel like what we need to do now is go back to the roots of this whole thing, because as you said, there's a lot of talk about, this person fighting this person, everything in our media is taken out of context. But the truth is that the whole Israeli project, as a settler colonial entity in the heart of the Middle East, was to do with the interests of imperialism. It had nothing to do with Jews. It had nothing to do actually with Zionism. Zionism and the creation of a Jewish state became a cover. The Holocaust of Jews in the Second World War was used as another cover, although that was not the beginning of Zionism or the beginning of Israel. But again, these things are used as cover, as a story to justify something which is essentially unjustifiable, which is we are going to take a land which is occupied, we're going to parachute in a population which is loyal to us, and we're going to make a deal with them because this area is important to us. Why is it important to us? Because we have discovered oil here, a lot of oil here, just at the moment when industry and war machines are transitioning from their former coal power to oil power. So this was what made oil the most important resource of the 20th century. And that was what made the control of the Middle East of such paramount importance to the imperialists. And we have to not forget that it was the British who instigated this whole movement. The Americans took it over. But it was the British who instigated it, the British imperialists. And Israel is essentially an armed base. It's not a country in the kind of normal sense. It's a base of highly motivated but deniable fighters, right? You've got a whole population, which is essentially your army. You give it a few billion every year. It's a cheap army. And the body bags don't come home. The body bags stay where they are. So in many respects, it's very useful. But this entire population that's been planted there, the settler colonial population, is loyal to the imperialists and to the imperialist system, and is there precisely to control not just the Palestinian territory, but the whole Middle Eastern region. So, Dad, I wondered if you could talk to us a little bit about the genesis of the Israeli project and of Zionism.
There are 2 points I'd like to make Joti and Caleb, and that is the genesis of Zionism goes even further back than the discovery of oil. The discovery of oil does not come till much later. It comes in the 20th century, after the end of the second decade of the 20th century. Before that, it was a struggle between the powers to control India. India was the jewel in the British colonial crown, and whoever controlled India had tremendous power, not only over the exploitation of India's natural resources and manpower, but also using India's manpower to conquer other places. The British used the Indian soldiers not only to conquer the rest of India one by one, but also to send them to China, to send them to Afghanistan, to send them all over the place to conquer these places for them. And so British were very, very keen to make sure that India was safe against Russian Tsarism, and safe against France, which was the rival European power. And there are two names that come up again and again if you read the earlier history of this project, and that is Palmerston and Lord Shaftesbury, and they were evangelical Christians, and they also believed in converting the Jews to Christianity, and they could always bring biblical quotations how it's important to convert the Jews to Christianity, and then there will come a day when there will be liberation for the whole of humanity. We won't go into that topic today. So there was a mixture of religious obscurantism with real interest. So Zionism was never a Jewish project. Actually, right up to the 20s, right up to the rise of Hitler, the Jews continued overwhelmingly to oppose the project. When the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917 by the Foreign Secretary of Britain, Balfour, who had earlier been Prime Minister of Britain, but he was now Foreign Secretary in Lloyd George's administration, the only Jewish member of the cabinet, Edwin Montagu, wrote a note to the cabinet saying the Balfour Declaration was an anti-Semitic document, because what it's trying to do is it's trying to tell the Jewish people that they don't belong here. They are not French, they are not English, they are not whatever. They are actually from Palestine. And where they found actually good help was from the Zionists. The Zionist ideology is actually very similar to the Nazi ideology, to the ideology of Hitler. Hitlerites believed Jews do not belong to Germany, and by extension, they do not belong to Europe. Their place is in Palestine. And the Zionists said, yes, our place is in Palestine. And their leaders continued to say, the problem is not with the Nazis, the problem is with us, because we don't have a state of our own. We Jews are the problem. You know, nobody wants us. We want to have a separate state. Instead of actually joining with the proletariat of the respective country to fight for their common liberation, as happened in Russia, and the Russian Revolution brought liberation not only to Russian people, generally speaking, but also to the Jews. And all the laws against Jews were actually abolished within the first few days of the establishment of the Russian Soviet Republic. And the Jews were in the vanguard of that struggle. If you look at the first Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party, the Jews are disproportionately represented. The fact that some of them would go renegades later on, like Kamenev, Zinoviev, Trotsky, doesn't say much. There were lots of other Jews whose names you and I don't probably know. We only remember Kaganovich, but there are lots of others who were Jews, if you like. So Zionist ideology came very handy for imperialism, because if they wanted to be in Palestine, any power that could use them for their own purposes, and the two powers that could use were the French and the British. The British proved to be much cleverer, because after the Second World War, when under the name of the League of Nations mandates to hide the word colonialism, the British made sure that they got the mandate for Palestine and the area that is Iraq today, Mesopotamia, if you like. And they got there, and the moment they get there, did I say Second World War? I mean after the First World War. Once they get the mandate, they then bring in Jewish immigration into the area. After a while, it becomes alarming for the local Arab population, and the Arabs of Palestine revolted in 1936. It was a powerful rebellion which lasted 3 years, during which time the British demolished 2,000 homes, imprisoned 10,000 Palestinians, and did horrible things to the British, and in the process armed the Zionists to fight on their side. But in the end, the British realized that they had to restrict immigration to calm the Palestinian people. And the moment they started restricting immigration, they earned the wrath of the Zionists. So the Zionists fought against the British. They killed some powerful persons in Palestine. They bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, killed a lot of British soldiers. In the end, the British got fed up and they handed over Palestine to the United Nations. And the United Nations came up with this scheme to divide Palestine. You know, believe it or not, 56% of it was granted to the Jews, Zionists really, you should say, not Jews, and the rest of it to the Palestinians. And then when the Arab forces protested against it, there was a war in 1948, the Zionists occupied even more territory, leaving behind mere 22%. And that was what they captured in the 7-Day War in 1967 and controlled the whole area. And that is the source of the trouble. And the source of the trouble is imperialism and Zionism. Zionists were considered mad. Edmund Montague said they are mad people. They should be outlawed. No Zionist organization should be allowed in the country. They should be made illegal. They mention every Jew. But 2 Jews they don't mention is Karl Marx. You know, at least nominally he was a Jew. He wasn't really. He was as much of a Jew as I am a Sikh, right? And the other one is Edmund Montague. Because to bring Edmund Montague, they have to say he was speaking sense. He was speaking against Zionism. And every sensible person spoke against Zionism at that time. The Jews who were Zionists in Germany were so happy when Hitler came with his Nuremberg laws, which outlawed the Jewish activity in several ways. They said, fantastic, because our greatest enemy is assimilationism. We want to fight against assimilation. Hitler is our friend. And one day, when the beautiful state of Israel is created, there will be a beautiful monument to the Nazis and to Hitler, because they made it possible for us to have a state of our own. So that's the ideology we're speaking of. If anybody is a fascist, more than anybody else, it's the Zionists and their imperialist backers who are fascists. We are not fascists. We're fighting against fascism, including against Zionist fascism. People tell you a Jew cannot be a fascist. Why can't a Jew be a fascist? Fascism is an ideology of the ruling class, of the imperialist ruling class in a crisis. So anyone joining that brigade can be a fascist, whatever their ethnic origins, because fascism is not described by ethnicity, nor is it described by the size or the style of the mustache that a man wears. You know, it's an ideology which grips the ruling classes of imperialist countries at certain periods, and that's why people will tell you in Ukraine, how can you say Ukraine is fascist when you got a Jewish president? First of all, Jewish president is not a president. He's got a gun held to his temple. He's got to do what he's told. The moment he does not, there would be no Zelensky in living form. He would be gone to some cemetery. Imperialism will get rid of him. They're trying to get rid of him. He's already on the way out. So I think we should not get into the idea that only a certain ethnicity can produce Hitlerites, or that only a certain country can, that only Germany can produce. No, the Japanese have produced their own version. The Italians have produced their own version. So fascism, the the Francoites in Spain produced their own version. So it's not confined to a specific country or to a specific ethnicity.
And more than that, when it comes to fascistic, aggressive, barbaric behavior towards the rest of the world, all the imperialist states indulge in fascistic activity abroad. Right? That's how they hold down the colonies, and that's exactly what Israel is. Israel is a little military outpost where the people have been bribed in order to be the enforcers of this fascistic policy over the native population. Caleb.
Well, it's also important because around what we're talking about here, I see a huge amount of distortion. It's important, as you said, to point out that prior to the Second World War, the majority of Jews in the world rejected Zionism and were advocates of some variant of Marxism, social democracy, anarchism, or Bolshevism, and that there was a very clear divide among Jews over that question. The Zionists, Theodore Herzl and others, said that Marxism was their greatest enemy. There's an article by Winston Churchill that I see posted around the internet that says this. Winston Churchill wrote, Zionism versus Bolshevism, the struggle for the soul of the Jewish people. And he says just that. And I have seen many, many people use that article to try and argue that somehow Zionism and Marxism are all part of a big conspiracy. And this is a really widespread trend among people that are dissidents in the United States. This belief that communism and Zionism are all wrapped up. They're all part of a secret Wall Street cabal or something. And it's just not true. And the more you dig into the facts people use to try and make that argument, the more you see that this is just anti-Semitism. It's just hatred for Jewish people on an ethnic level. The Bolsheviks were very clear. They considered Zionism to be a reactionary trend of the Jewish bourgeoisie. I believe that's on the first page of Stalin's On the National Question. And that Lenin was quite harsh in his opposition to the Bundists, even, right? The Bundists were not Zionists, but they advocated a separate Jewish organization for socialists. And he said, no, we have to have the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. We have to have Bolshevism. And that this is a widespread deception, and that this attempt to make everything into a conspiracy. There are conspiracies that go on, obviously, and there was quite a bit of foul play by the Zionists in order to set the stage for the creation of Israel. They did bomb synagogues in Iraq and other places in order to encourage Jews from countries throughout the regions to come to Israel. That's been documented, and that there was a lot of conspiratorial activity. And I mean, you can talk about these things, but the idea that everything is just a big giant plot, this is a disempowering notion that gets put out, and it's a way of leading people into a state of paralysis where they can't do anything about anything. And it also has some fascistic undertones, right? I mean, the idea. I mean, unfortunately now, the thing we do have to address, though, is that the Soviet Union unfortunately did vote for the creation of Israel at the United Nations in 1948, and that even though up until the Second World War there had been huge opposition to Zionism, the Communist Party of the United States in particular played a very negative role in 1948. They were supporting the creation of Israel, et cetera. And that was a huge mistake on the part of the global communist movement. And I think it was based on the fact that there was a belief that because of the Holocaust and because of the events of the Second World War, that a Jewish state would be one that would be sympathetic to the Soviet Union and to people's struggles for national liberation. And I mean, that was quickly proven to be a false projection. But I'd be curious what both of you have to say about why this error was made.
First of all, I do not know why this error was made, because it's completely alien to Marxism that Jews are a separate nation, and it's completely alien to what Stalin had throughout said. What the internal dynamics in the Politburo and the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union were, I do not know. But the state of Israel, I mean, the only possible, and it's a conjecture, it's no more than that, was that Jews had been treated very badly by the Nazis. They were oppressed and they were in a bad way. and to express certain amount of sympathy, if they could live happily along with the Arabs, was not in itself a bad idea. Also, the Zionists at that time pretended to be socialists.
Yes.
And they could have become an arm of the liberation movement against British imperialism in the Middle East and actually get rid of the domination of the French and the British in the Middle East. But these are conjectures. I do not know. But it soon became clear that the Zionists had sold themselves to the Americans, and they were in every socialist country in the Eastern Bloc. They were sending their agents and using their language skills and their connections with the Jewish populations to incite them against the socialist system, and also to cause a lot of them to emigrate to Israel, or if they didn't want to go to Israel, to United States or Europe, and thus depriving the Soviet Union of very talented people who were needed for the reconstruction of the country, of all these countries following the devastation of the Second World War. So the Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations with with Israel in 1948, and they were condemned. They could see where they were going. Golda Meir goes to Soviet Union, has a conversation with Ilya Ehrenberg, and she says to them that Jews should speak Hebrew or at the least Yiddish. And it disgusts her when she sees Jews who cannot speak any of these languages. And he said to her, "You are just a servant of US imperialism," right? And so they continue to do that. They use their position to actually incite people against the Soviet Union. And they played that dirty role, not from then onwards, right up to today. The very people who were most sympathetic to the Jews against Nazism, at the foremost of those people were the communists, and their hatred is reserved for them. The person who actually all his life fought against anti-Semitism from his early life, when he was only 21, 22, up to his death, was Stalin. And yet he is the one who is singled out to be the monster, who was an anti-Semite. I'm at the moment busy, not reviewing really, to give some ideas that are produced in Domenico Lusurdo's book on the black legend, Stalin, the History and Critique of a Black Legend. He is somebody who everywhere has brought liberation to national minorities. He was a commissar of nationalities. A lot of Trotskyites will tell you he was given an unimportant job. No, it was the most important job in the Soviet Union, how to keep people with such divergent religions and ethnicities together as Soviet people. And Stalin's policy in Ukraine, for example, of Ukrainization of Ukraine, bringing the Ukrainian language, publishing books, journals, producing theater plays, producing movies for the cinemas, and bringing into high positions, instead of Russians, Ukrainian officials. That was a tremendous thing that was done. Precisely at that time when that was taking place, what should Trotsky do? Trotsky should demand the separation of Ukraine from the Soviet Union, under the guise of saying that the Ukrainians are oppressed by the Stalinist bureaucracy. There's a word which is meaningless. It means nothing. They are being suppressed by the bureaucracy. And that is what the imperialists, especially Hitlerites, were trying to do, to separate Ukraine. Not because they wanted Ukrainians, they considered Ukrainians to be the Untermensch, the subhuman beings. They didn't want Ukrainians, but they wanted Ukrainian land, which is very fertile, and they wanted, of course, Ukraine's industry, which has been developed under the Soviet Union. Ukraine was a backward peasant country before Soviet Union, and all the industry that was developed under the aegis of the Soviet Union. And most of it was in the region which is now under the control of the Donbass and Lugansk republics. That was the center of the Ukrainian industrial infrastructure. So that is precisely what took place there. And they were against the Soviet Union precisely because Soviet Union was bringing liberation. It had become a challenge. It was calling people all over the world who were oppressed and were suffering under the heel of colonialism to rise up, because that is the way to liberation. Because in the Soviet Union, the liberation came under the flag of the Communist Party. It came under the flag of the proletariat. It wasn't a liberation struggle led by the people of those countries against, the rulers in Russia. No, it was a joint effort by the Russian proletariat and the proletariat of all these countries to get rid of colonialism, to bring culture, and they brought into use local languages for administration and for literature and for teaching in the schools, and brought into life languages which hadn't been used for a long time, languages that didn't even have scripts. The Soviet pedagogues went along inventing scripts for those languages. That is the effect of Soviet rule. Of course, they hated the Soviet Union, and you can expect them to. From their point of view, it was the monster. Just as in its own day, the French bourgeoisie was considered as a hated bourgeoisie by the monarchist Europe. And those days, Paris was the center of revolutionaries everywhere. Just as after the October Revolution, Moscow became the center for revolutionaries everywhere.
Thanks, Dad. I'm going to move us on to one last topic before we finish. Very briefly, something that you brought up there, Harpal, and that I think is really significant actually in this moment, which is when I looked at this big launch of this Al-Aqsa flood battle, and I thought about the geopolitical shift that's been happening, what occurred to me was we are looking here at the Ukraine war effect, right, which is impacting so many things, which already impacted the geopolitics in the Middle East, because the imperialists' combined efforts are focused so hard on trying to destroy Russia through Ukraine. They're throwing all their resources into it, constantly dredging the bottom of the barrel and printing more money to send to Ukraine, emptying their arsenals to send to Ukraine. They've sent weapons from South Korea to Ukraine, weapons from Israel to Ukraine, right? They've been sending everything one way to try to win, but they're not winning there, but they are weakening themselves. And while that was happening, we had this quiet maneuvers in diplomacy going on, where China was using the space that had been created in the Middle East to help bring about this diplomatic rapprochement. And we saw this real global geopolitical shift happening in the Middle East, that, wars and conflicts coming to an end, and under the kind of peace that can only be negotiated when the USA is not present. We're starting to see the beginnings of all these things. And it seems to me that it's a very propitious moment for the Palestinian resistance. That obviously this battle's been in preparation a long time. There is no way they just decided one day, woke up and decided to launch this. They've been working on all of these mechanisms that they brought together for a long time. That's very clear. But the moment they chose to launch it, where the imperialists' attention is elsewhere, where they are pretty used up in terms of a lot of their resources, and where the shift in the Middle East is in their favor, where the shift globally with Russia and China, the anti-imperialist bloc generally becoming stronger, with Iran having joined the BRICS as well as Saudi Arabia, with a whole network of support available. Already, the remaining occupation forces of the USA in the Middle East are starting to look very, very, very vulnerable. Their days remaining in Syria are clearly numbered. And as a result, Israel also was beginning to look very, very weak, even without the fact they've had a year of internal protests, and the regime is looking so weak because it's riven with fascism and can't hold itself together. Its attention was elsewhere, right? So all of these things seem to come together to give a very propitious moment for this assault by the Palestinian Liberation Forces. And I wondered, Harpal, if you thought the same in terms of the timing of this.
Well, first of all, my view is, as you have already stated in so many words, Palestinian resistance would have launched this attack whether there was any shift in geopolitics or not, because they're fighting for their liberation and they can't carry on being suppressed all the time. But certainly it helps. As Che Guevara famously once said, the one way to deal with imperialism is to create several Vietnams, so that imperialism has to fight at several fronts. Now, it has not been engineered, it has not been coordinated by anybody, but the fact that this resistance movement has erupted in such a powerful way in the Israeli conflict with the Palestinians is a welcome development, because it actually diverts U.S. attention from Ukraine. They can't pay the same attention to both these places. And as somebody rightly said, the Israelis have more clout in Washington than the Ukrainians have. So if anybody has to win in getting the most of the resources, it's the Israelis who will get. One way or the other, it's a bad news for imperialism. It would have been anyway without any shift in geopolitics, but in view of the fact that they are being beaten in Ukraine against Russia, is now, of course, something which is added to by the latest eruption of resistance movements activities in Israel. And they have broken the myth of the invincibility of Israel. If it hadn't been broken by Hezbollah in the war of 2006, where actually the Zionists were beaten, and after 35 days they had to retreat, and they would be very hard put to starting a fight against Hezbollah again. I'm not saying they won't, because reactionaries are fools. As Mao Zedong said, they lift a rock to drop it on their own feet. They will probably do it, but if they do it, they will be courting for further disaster. So that is something very, very important to remember. And when it comes to dividing the forces, of course, the forces are being divided. American imperialism is going from one place to another, and it cannot win everywhere. There's not a single conflict since the Second World War that it has come out of as a winning, apart from Grenada. Population 90,000. American army goes and has a regime change. But elsewhere, they have suffered nothing but defeat after defeat. So I think there is something wonderful about what is happening. And I think we have a time to go to ordinary people who have a sense of decency, even in imperialist countries. How would you like it? How would you feel if your country was invaded by others, all their land and homes were taken away from them, and they were living in some refugee camps in the marshes of Louisiana or somewhere? How would you do that? Would you not fight? Now the Israelis have been going in there tens of thousands to these demonstrations, which are against the present Israeli government's judicial reform, which compared with what the Palestinians suffer is nothing. And in those demonstrations, the question of Palestine is nowhere. But to her credit, and I think she saved the honor of Jewish people as well as American Jewish people. There was one woman taking part in that demonstration against the judicial reform, carrying a placard with a hand-painted flag of Palestine, saying, "We didn't worry about the occupation, and we got dictatorship." People have to learn to fight against dictatorial rule, because if they don't, it will be their turn. So the judicial reform is very oppressive to the so-called liberal Zionists in Israel. But occupation is not something that bothers them. They've got to learn to actually accept that occupation is the problem. And I think they will sooner or later come to realize, because they will no more win their battles against the Palestinians than the French army did against the Algerians in the war of liberation that Algeria fought in the late 50s. They were as vicious as the Zionists are in dealing with the Algerian people. But in the end, it was the Algerians who won. And de Gaulle actually had to accept the fact that this Algeria could not be kept part of France. And there were a lot of left-wingers who said, of course Algeria is part of France. It's a province of France. Well, the Algerians thought differently, and they won their liberation. And I think Palestinians will do too. It's a pity I won't be alive to watch that liberation. But both of you are young enough. You will see that, and then you will remember what I said.
You might be surprised yet, Dad. Caleb, last word to you.
Oh, well, I'm in agreement with much of, if not all of what Harpal said, and that geopolitical alignment is very important, and that is the new world that is breaking out. And I'll also add that, the struggle that's happening, the confrontation in Israel between Netanyahu supporters and more liberal Israelis, that's the breakdown of Western imperialism. And it's similar to what's happening with the new right in Europe, or what's happening with Trump here, is that their system is failing. And there is a divide between some of the lower levels of capital and the overall, geostrategic agenda of the big imperialist monopolies, and it's worth paying attention to because revolutionary forces can maneuver within this. I will say I'm very, very disappointed by seeing some of the voices that were very anti-war and are very opposed to sending weapons to Ukraine saying horrendous things about the Israel conflict, calling to flatten Gaza, etc. And it's very disappointing to see forces that have started to wake up regarding Ukraine be so wrong on the Palestine issue. But that just means that those of us who understand the big picture and have an ideology and a way of viewing the world that can explain everything, we have our work cut out for us. And so we have an important thing to do. We got to build a working class, socialist, anti-imperialist movement.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. On that rare note of agreement.
All right.